Milei's success will be measured in whether he can bring down inflation. Immediately after that, whether he can provide some level of economic growth. As I said, the Argentine economy has been virtually flat since 2011, 2012, which means some years it has gone down, some years it has gone up, but always back to the same level we were at in 2012.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. With the rapid rise of the libertarian advocate Javier Milei from never holding political office before 2021 to becoming the president of Argentina in 2023, a deeper contextualization of the political economy of Argentina is necessary. For this, I am joined by Bruno Binnetti, a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics and a fellow of the Inter-American Dialogue. Let's get to it. Hi, Bruno, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Argentina is an understatement to say that has been in the news recently, but people tend to obviously see it via the recent Milei election. And of course, there's always a background story and context to why these things end up the way they are. And Argentina has been essentially butt of many economic jokes for decades. And I'm curious about the structural conditions of Argentina, because from the outside, anyone looks at Argentina and they're stunned by how the economic crisis is even persistent after all these years or decades as it is. So if we could start there, I know it's an ambitious question, but we can dissect it as we go through. Are the conditions in Argentina that has perverted it from being able to be the best economy in Latin America?
Big question, and one I think Argentinians have been trying to grapple with for a long time. I would say to some decades of history that the problems began for Argentina around the 1960s and 70s when the model of industrialization by import substitution reached its peak and its limits. There was a limit up to which Argentina had been industrializing at a fast rate, especially compared to other Latin American countries. And around the 1970s, that model entered a profound crisis. Even though Argentina had been able to develop a few industrial sectors, they weren't competitive enough internationally. That meant they needed a lot of protection and a lot of support from the state. It was different from, let's say, the case of Korea, which industrialized, oriented towards the external markets. That wasn't the case in Argentina. And when that model went into crisis, governments responded by increasing intervention and money printing and trying to preserve that model as much as possible. That didn't work. Argentina entered a very deep crisis in the 1980s, along with the rest of Latin America, hyperinflation, etc. Unlike other countries in Latin America, I would say, in the 1990s, during the so-called neoliberal era, rather than take a gradual approach to inflation control through independent central bank containing money printing, etc. What Argentina retorted to was pegging the peso to the dollar, which other countries had attempted to do in Latin America. In the case of Argentina, I think it was so successful in the short term, and this is a problem with a lot of reforms in Argentina. It was so effective in the short term to contain and eliminate inflation that Argentine elites became addicted to the peg, and they didn't implement reforms, or they didn't gradually lift the peg in a way that would have been sustainable for the Argentine economy. That meant that the neoliberal model, if you will, crashed in 2001, one of Argentina's most serious political, social, economic crisis, collapse of GDP, 60% poverty rate, and Argentina crashed out of that peg with the dollar. And that opened the way for the hegemony of the Kirchners, which were from a different side of Peronism, the left-wing side of Peronism. They benefited from a commodity boom. They expanded again the role of the state in the economy. They created a sort of very precarious type of welfare state, if you will, not so much on public services that continue to be relatively deficient, but at least a sort of social net that would contain those that had been displaced from the formal economy by the crisis in 2001, 2002. So that was kind of the center of the Kirchnerist project in Argentina. The problem with that model, again, was that in the short term it helped and the economy was booming, not so much because of economic policies, but just because the international context was so positive for Argentina. But that started to change around 2012. And since then, Argentina has been completely unable to grow its economy. No political party has been able to set a course towards economic stability. Inflation came back as a serious problem for Argentina. And we've been stuck in that ever since. Between 2015 and 2019, the pro-market center-right governed under former President Mauricio Macri. He tried a sort of gradual approach to pro-market economic reforms that didn't work. I'm not sure the problem was that they were gradual. I think the problem was that Macri's people, I think, were overly optimistic about how, if they began to change economic policies towards a pro-market direction, there were going to be an influx of investment and the economy would quickly take off. That didn't work. Macri's term ended in an even worse economic crisis with even higher inflation that he inherited and with a massive debt with the International Monetary Fund. That in turn opened the way for a return of Kirchnerism, but with really no new ideas. It was just a return trying to recreate what had worked for Kirchnerism under that era of economic boom in the early 2000s. But those days are over. So what you ended up is an even more unsustainable situation. And I think you have to understand both Macri's failure to change that model as well as the decline of the Kirchner's model to make sense of how Milei managed to break into the scene and win the presidency. He rallied against both Kirchnerism and the center-right opposition that failed to change the Kirchnerist model. It was that anger Argentines had towards all incumbents that allowed Milei to win with this message of all politicians have betrayed you. All politicians only care about themselves. I am the only one who can truly deliver change in this country. And that's let him, he won decisively on the second round, not on the first. His core, I would say, supporters are around 30% of the electorate. But certainly there was so much anger against Kirchnerism that pushed me in the second round. That's, I would say, if I have to sum it up, that would be the essence of it.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. Let's go back to initial Kirchnerism. So it's back now in 2001, when we had a severe crisis where it was Kirchner, this is the first Kirchner, was able to be elected. The sentiment at the time in Argentina, obviously, it swung quite left in many ways. What kind of, let's say, policy agenda did they have in mind? Do you think they believe from their policy discussions that they were fulfilling the policies they wanted to get done? Or they were giving power and we'll figure out as we go type administration?
Good question. And I think you have to start by saying the Kirchner, Nestor Kirchner especially, but also his wife, Cristina Kirchner, they are Peronists. So that means that they were part of the political party that, sure, in the 1940s created the beginnings of Argentine welfare state, etc. But they were also part of the coalition and the party that supported President Carlos Menem as he was implementing the neoliberal reforms in the 1990s. If anything, there was a sort of shift to the left because Nestor Kirchner understood that after the crisis in 2001, what society demanded was a return of the state as a key actor in the economy after the failure, let's say, of the neoliberal reforms in the 90s. So pragmatism always was a very important component of why Kirchner did what he did. I think this was part of a context in Latin America in which a lot of left-wing, center-left governments were taking office, moving their countries in different but relatively similar directions, at least, towards more state, towards more active social policies, cash transfer programs, perhaps a bit more protectionism, etc. And at first, this worked for Argentina because the economy was booming. Everything Argentina grew at like 10% a year. And that, of course, made Kirchner and then his wife very popular. The problem, I think, was that, again, and this happens all the time in Argentine history, I think, because this model was so politically effective and so popular, they really didn't know how to begin to shift towards more pro-market, or at least less interventionist policies. So when growth began to end because of changes in the Chinese economy and the relative decline of commodity prices, rather than say, okay, we did as much as we could in the direction of strengthening public services and reasserting the state as an actor in the economy, now we need to shift. Rather than do that, they double down in order to, I would say, preserve their political support and political capital. And that meant that particularly during Cristina Kirchner's term and after 2011, I would say, what ended up being the priority was preserving their political support at all costs. And that meant blocking any sort of reforms, trying to capture as much of the economy as possible in the hands of the state so that they could continue their policies of redistribution. They nationalized the country's largest oil company that had been privatized in the 90s. They took control of all pension funds in Argentina and used that to continue financing public works and social programs. But eventually the money ran out. And of course, they printed money, a lot of it, to finance a growing fiscal deficit. And that fueled inflation. But they became absolutely incapable of recognizing their own mistakes. And they ran out of ideas, I would say. They were so popular at the beginning, and they still have, Cristina Kirchner still has significant popularity, particularly among the poor. There are millions of people that live in the outskirts of Buenos Aires in very precarious conditions, and Cristina Kirchner is quite popular among them, I would say. Peronism in general is. But they lost touch with the rest of the country. And I think they thought when Macri defeated them in 2015, it seems that Kirchnerism was over. Then Macri's reforms started to fail, I would say. And then Kirchnerism returned, and they thought because the reforms under Macri had failed, they felt vindicated. They felt that they were back and that they were going to stay, and they didn't feel the need to introduce economic reforms. They thought they could continue with business as usual, and that exploded. And that brought us to the situation we are today, both a massive economic crisis and a complete outsider in power.
What did Macri try to do when he essentially was campaigning, then eventually won the election to be president? And then why do you think it was not be able to break through and actually have a sustained impact on the economy?
I think he had a very successful first couple of years in government. He managed to solve a long-standing debt issue that Cristina Kirchner had refused to acknowledge. Argentina defaulted many times in its history, and when Macri took office, Argentina was cut off from financial markets. So Macri reached a deal with some holdouts from the previous default that normalized the situation. They began to take debt on the international market again to finance the deficit. In the meantime, I think perhaps Macri took too long to move towards fiscal consolidation. I think Macri's team was afraid that if they cut the deficit too fast at the beginning, they were going to lose political support, and that would make their government very fragile politically. So they tried to cover the deficit with more debt rather than take on the fiscal deficit. And that, I think, presented problems later on. But at least at the beginning, Macri lifted most currency restrictions. Inflation was high, also because Macri cut subsidies for public utilities. In the areas of Buenos Aires, people really don't pay what they should for electricity, water, and other public services because they're heavily subsidized. Macri tried to reverse that. And at least at the beginning, the economy was started to grow. Macri's party did fairly well in the midterms in 2017, but that was it. Immediately after that, I would say, the whole thing began to come down crushing because Macri's success in the first 2 years depended on international financing and international capital coming into Argentina. So he lifted restrictions. People started buying Argentine debt again. But 2018, around April, conditions in the global economy changed and that capital flew out of Argentina. And that meant a lot of pressure on the peso. Nobody wanted to buy Argentine debt anymore. And that led Macri to get this $44 billion loan from the IMF. Rather than reinforce the situation and generate confidence, that generated panic, I would say. And Macri was never able to regain control, I would say, and he left with much higher inflation, with a huge debt problem, and with an economy that was not growing anymore. That's in a nutshell what went wrong. I'm not an economist. I can't say what exactly Macri should have done better. It seems to me that the first 2 years, optimism was excessive, and it seems to me that they overestimated how much they could finance the deficit with external financing, and they didn't anticipate that as soon as macroeconomic conditions in the global economy changed, all that capital that was flowing in the first 2 years was going to flow out. And that is exactly what happened.
So right after Macri, you had Fernandez, I believe, who was also part of the same Peronism ideology again. So it swung right back to that idea. We've actually mentioned this term a few times. I don't think people have that much context for what it means. Could you describe what Peronism means, at least in political context?
Peronism was founded in the 1940s by a military guy who was Juan Perón, who was elected for the presidency in Argentina in 1946 for the first time. And I think Perón was a very astute politician. He understood that there was a mass of workers that no political party was talking to in Argentina. So as soon as he took office, he built labor unions. Argentina had some, but they were not as powerful. He turned them into the core of his political movement. And to this day, labor unions in Argentina are politically aligned with Peronism. Perón created the sort of basics of the welfare state in Argentina. He incorporated millions of people who felt completely out of the political, economic, and social system in Argentina. You still hear to this day people remember how they managed to see the sea for the first time, go to the beach for the first time because of Peronist labor unions that financed their trip, or how people got a hospital built or new housing built in their neighborhoods that had been abandoned for decades during Perón's government. And that's a very powerful sort of memory, true or not, or maybe distorted and exaggerated, but that's a very powerful memory. The thing is, Perón was overthrown by the army. He spent a lot of time in exile. He came back in the 70s. He died soon after. And it's not ideologically defined. Perón, even though he was a democratically elected leader, he got a lot of inspiration from sort of fascism in the sense that providing welfare, mobilizing the masses behind the leader, a very kind of corporatist view of the state, with the state playing a key role in all areas, controlling foreign trade, etc. That was the Peronism in the 40s. But since then, Peronism is more a way of exercising power rather than a concrete ideology. And the greatest example of this is that in the 1990s, as we discussed, these pro-market reforms following the so-called Washington Consensus were all undertaken under a Peronist government in Argentina. And then one member of that party, Kirchner, ended up shifting the party and the country back towards left-wing policies, etc. So it's very hard to pinpoint Peronism ideologically, because a lot of the same people would shift positions very frequently, and that keeps happening. But in general, Peron is connected to the working classes in Argentina. In general, Peronism has attributed itself being the representative of the poor and the people more broadly in Argentina. And for a long time, Peronism has been able to present everybody who opposes them as sort of representatives of the oligarchy or elites or whatever. particularly under the Kirchners, that sort of returned to the original concept of Peronism. And Milei disrupted that. And I think that was part of his appeal. Milei shifted that rhetoric and say, no, you are the true oligarchy. The true oligarchy are politicians. And I think that was very smart of him. And that sort of was very hard to counteract because, in a sense, you could say in the typical populist framework, Milei used that playbook against the Kirchners. And I think that's part of his appeal and part of his success.
I find it very ironic because in many ways the Kirchners are populists by many definitions, but then Milei now is described as the populace, but then the Kirchner is described as institutional class in some way.
Yeah, I think one has to be careful with the term populism because people tend to call populism or tend to label as populist things they don't like. And that happens a lot. What I do think there's in common between Kirchner, Nestor Kirchner, Cristina Kirchner, and Milei is the way in which they portray themselves as political leaders and the way in which they relate to other institutions in the state. I would say Milei has been in office for only days now, but it's clear that he sees his democratic legitimacy as coming directly from the people. And he thinks that Congress or the courts, all sorts of potential checks and balances, etc., are obstacles that the political caste uses to try to stop his reforms, to try to protect their own corrupt interests, etc. And that's very similar to what Kirchner and Cristina Kirchner said when they were in power. There is an attitude towards the rule of law, an attitude towards the separation of powers, towards following the legal procedure that I think is very common, very similar between the Kirchners and Milei. And in that sense, I think it applies to both. You could call them both populist, even if the contents of the policies they pursue are very different. I think the way in which they pursue them are quite similar.
That's a good point. Now, earlier before the call, we had a brief interlude about structural deficiencies in Argentina, politically, economically, socially, so on. Now, Milei has said many things on the campaign trail, and a lot of these things are actually very social related in terms of how society is organized, about how society is taught values and various things like that. But then a lot of these structural reforms that he wants to do are, to put it mildly, very abrupt and very deep. And oftentimes, at least I cannot think of any examples of any country that has been able to pull off such deep structural reforms in a very quick, when I mean quick, I mean less than a generation. So that's super quick. He wants to do it in 5 years. But I'm curious what kind of these structural reforms, when you mention this term, do you mean or come to mind firstly?
So adding to what you just said, and I agree, it's even harder to imagine someone doing this with the support Milei has in Congress. His party controls very few seats because he's an outsider, because he entered politics only 2 years ago. He didn't have a political party 2 years ago. That means his own political party is full of people with no experience, have already fought among themselves, are not really cohesive, and they are very few in both houses of Congress. So that makes it even harder, I think, to implement or to enact such reforms. This past week, President Milei presented a massive executive decree with more than 300 articles that tackle what he would consider the structural constraints to our economic society, etc. And they target certain protected areas, I would say, of the economy, certain privileges, if you will. I don't know, private companies have to register in order to export certain goods, import restrictions, currency restrictions, pardons and regulations of very different sectors that I agree have been constraining economic growth and dynamism and competitiveness in Argentina for a long time. They include things such as the power labor unions have over the health system in Argentina, which is a legacy of the political power Peronist labor unions have had. There are a lot of areas in which Milei, through this massive executive decree, is trying to remove the state from the equation and allow people to reach agreements alone and with very little supervision from the state. Now, the decree is massive. Its implications are still being debated, discussed, and analyzed as we speak. But it's an example of, we're just discussing in the sense of how Milei doesn't feel that going through Congress and enacting these reforms through laws, which is the normal procedure, is doable because Milei's party is so weak in Congress, because he fears that if he tries to do this through the normal channels in Congress, the reforms are going to be blocked or watered down, etc. He feels that he needs to do this all together and through an executive decree. And that has presented problems. First, because if these structural reforms are implemented through executive decree, that makes them easy to reverse, because any other president who takes office could issue a new decree seeing these changes. Then it really, if Milei's argument is that Argentina needs to break with decades of lack of stability and clear regulations and a sort of regulatory stability that would allow the private sector to thrive, implementing changes by decree is not a safe way of doing that, because the courts will definitely intervene, because Congress now, even relatively moderate parties that would be willing to support most of these reforms in Congress, they don't want the president to go over their heads with an executive decree. Naturally, they want to preserve their own power in the institutional system. So I think this past week has been very intense in that sense, because the president seems to be convinced that, probably through an analysis of the Macri experience, I think Milei, and Macri himself, I think, would agree. Milei would think Macri's problem was that he was too moderate, that he went through Congress to try to reform the country, that he waited to see what was politically possible, that didn't want to irritate labor unions and other social groups, etc., too much. So he was too timid. And I'm not going to make that mistake. I think that's what Milei is telling us with this massive executive decree and a series of laws or bills that he has presented to Congress and that Congress will have to debate in the next few weeks. So I think that's the message. These reforms need to take place all together, all at once, and through executive decree, or we will never be able to get them through. And even though I don't agree with the idea of doing this by decree, one has to admit that Argentina does have a sort of very strong anti-reform antibodies. That's absolutely true. And you have a lot of interests that would be affected by any sort of reform. And they have been very successful through the ages in blocking these reforms. Even during, I would say, the so-called pro-market reforms of the 1990s, a lot of these groups, business groups, unions, political parties, etc., preserved a lot of influence and a lot of kind of protected areas within the economy and within the state that were not dismantled. So I think I have to admit that change in Argentina doesn't come easy. So that reinforces this idea that it's now or never and all at once, or it will never happen.
I agree with that. And I think the problem is in that core statement, where because of the buildup of consistent state intrusion over the last decades, unwinding that, if you were to do it slowly, would take decades. But then if you were to do it quickly, you have to do this kind of shock executive order. It is more risky because it's not as binding as a congressional approach. But then, as you said, the Congress is not, let's call it pro-shock reform, put it that way. So if you go through Congress, at best you will have the Macri situation. At worst, you just get nothing done. It's gridlock all the way. But at the same time, you, as say Milei, if Milei doesn't do the executive order approach, then he would not be able to get anything done, at least quickly. So his campaign would be essentially all lies. So it is a weird place to put yourself in. And then on top of all of that, there's this thing we say economics. So some people say economics, where economics is downstream of culture, in the sense that you need to have a cultural awareness and a cultural social norms to get particular economic outcomes. You can't often force the economic outcomes by going against cultural priorities. And in his case, Milei, although I think he is correct in his approach to policy reform, he is for sure going against a lot of cultural norms that people have in Argentina. It's a really tricky place to put yourself into.
Absolutely true. I think what he thinks, incorrectly, is that the cultural shift happened when he won the elections. He sees the 56% of the vote he obtained on the second round as an acknowledged by Argentines that shock therapy and that drastic retrench of the state is the only way forward. I think he overestimates that level of support. I think in that 56%, you have people that maybe 30% that supported Milei personally and that are personally loyal to him. And then you had other people who were tired of Kirchnerism, who wanted something else, or who were just angry and said, okay, I don't know this guy. Let's see. The problem is that all these exceptions, subsidies, cash transfers, etc., they have beneficiaries. Of course, in the middle, you have a lot of corruption, you have a lot of political patronage, and you have all of that. But there are real people benefiting from these policies. One key example, the Argentine state at the national, provincial, and local level is bloated. The number of employees in many sectors doesn't make any sense. I was reading on, I think somebody posted an analysis the other day that said that the rail network, which the state took over under the Kirchners, has 3-4 times more employees than Amtrak, but not nearly the number of trains that Amtrak runs every day. And that happens throughout the Argentine state. And that's absolutely true. The problem is, if you suddenly fire all those people, what are they going to do? It's not like some of these people have had these jobs for decades. They don't have many skills that could be reabsorbed by the private sector. The economy, because of the fiscal contraction Milei will enact, the economy has not grown in 2023, will not grow in 2024. So it's not if you retrench the state, automatically all of these people are suddenly going to find jobs in the private sector and everything will be fine. There are social consequences of all of this. The issue is, of course, that the impact, the social costs of the reforms are quick and immediate, and the benefits long-term and uncertain. And that, I think, that it's the problem of the reformer everywhere, not just in Argentina. And the problem for many other reformers has been exactly that. If you don't have positive results immediately, there is no way you will continue to win elections up until the point where the benefits of your reforms will begin to be apparent. And that's the thing. Argentina has midterms elections in 2025. That comes very quickly for any president. That's what Macri actually tried to do. He was very aware of this problem of the midterms, so he tried to reach the midterms with a growing economy, so he didn't perhaps go as fast as he wanted with some of the reforms because he didn't want the pain to be too bad. And the problem was, of course, he won those elections, but then the economy went out of control and then he ended up losing the presidential elections in 2019. So it's very hard to manage the social impact of the elections, the political impact of the reforms, and how to time everything so that it's politically sustainable. I think that's the huge challenge Milei has right now.
I'm very curious to see how his, call it PR team, is going to be positioning itself over the next 2 years, because his inauguration speech was very different from any I've heard, at least in recent times, where he was not like platitudes. He was given, oh, it's a great day to be here, it's a fun time ahead. He literally is like probably the most depressing inauguration speech in history in some ways. And because of that, I do wonder if they're going to take the approach of really saying the medicine is going to be hard almost every day and up until midterms, which is a very weird approach to take. But it feels if you don't have that approach, you're essentially not going to be able to say anything at all.
That's absolutely true. And what makes Milei peculiar, at least in Argentine history, but I think more broadly, is that he won the elections promising to slash public spending, to drastically cut or reduce the role of the state. And he said that was going to be painful. He said in Argentina that since the 2001 crisis and under Kirchnerism, even the word structural adjustment was politically taboo. Nobody would say that, not even Macri. You would try to find a synonym, you would try whatever, but you did not say structural adjustment because that reminded people of the pain and the social and economic crisis of 2001, 2002. Me completely reversed that. He said, no, we need it. I'm going to implement a structural adjustment. Even something like the IMF, who has been the villain of the Argentine left for decades now because of the conditionality that comes with IMF loans, etc. Milei said, oh no, I won't have any problems with the IMF because my reforms, my spending cuts, and my structural reforms are harsher than what the IMF wants. So I will not have any problems with the IMF. If anything, the IMF is too soft. And he won the elections. So, that is quite unique. And I think he emphasized that. One of his most popular catchphrases now is, there's no more money. No hay plata, which has become a sort of meme of everyday life, right? Hey, want to grab a beer? No hay plata. So that is quite unique. Of course, there's a limit to how much, even though Milei has been very clear about how painful this is going to be, that 2024 is going to be a very hard year, that inflation is going to go up because they're trying to normalize relative prices in the economy. They're trying to lift repressed kind of prices to reduce subsidies so that things actually cost what people should pay for them. But that doesn't mean that people will be willing to tolerate it for a long time. I think it was smart to be very blunt about what the situation is and how painful it's going to be. That will buy him perhaps a few months, but there's a limit. Announced or unannounced, there's a limit to how much pain and how much of a decrease in their income people will be willing to tolerate. So we will see whether that message is effective for long enough until the reforms begin to show results.
To me, like the inherent paradox of essentially the Milei election. So the international media framing of Milei is this ultra right-wing populist, that's a term you essentially see all the time. Then when you hear these things he actually says, no, that granted. If you follow him in any TikTok video on the campaign trail, that is a fair conclusion. But now, as the elected president, as now installed, he essentially speaks like a wartime president. Like, hey, this is a dark time. You gotta pull together. It's going to be tough. I can't say it's going to end anytime soon. The contrast is extreme. But because of that, as you just said, because it's not an actual war, I don't know if people are going to put up with it long enough. If he goes this current path, eventually it would get to a good point. But that's the problem. The electorate, given, as he also said, is not a huge number that's really his core supporters. They can retrench themselves at any point in time. It's really going to be tricky if you're going to sustain this kind of wartime rhetoric long enough where people literally don't revolt against him. That's definitely going to be an thing to look at. It's quite a sticky place to be in Argentina right now.
Absolutely. And I think because Milei is close to Donald Trump and former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, people, if you don't know too much about Milei or the context in Argentina, is, oh, he's Argentina's Trump, which, as you said, it explains some of Milei's characteristics, outsider, his alliance with more right-wing groups, whatever, but it's really not that accurate. Milei's obsession is the economy. Milei is a radical free trader, which Trump is not. Trump is an economic nationalist. Milei is very far from that. Bolsonaro himself, I don't think Bolsonaro really cares about economic matters that much. His real core message is about the culture wars and about all of that. Milei, sure, he has spoken, as you said, about that, but he's really dropped that during the campaign, and his priority is the economy. It also contributed the fact that for the second round, Milei got Macri's support and the support of most members of Macri's party and voters, at least. And some of those voters definitely agree with Milei's economic rhetoric and the direction he wants to take the Argentine economy towards, but they don't necessarily agree with him socially. They don't think that it's a priority to reverse the legalization of abortion. Argentina, for instance, have had legal gay marriage since 2010. In Argentina, these things of the culture wars are there, as in any other country, and they're very outspoken people against these social measures, but I don't think it's the essence. And Milei, I think quite smartly, at least for now, has focused on his economic message because he knows that he can't afford to lose any support by going into the traditional kind of culture war issue of the ultra-right. The problem is, of course, or the risk, is whether if the reforms don't show results, whether Milei will try to keep his core base of support mobilized by turning to those issues. I think I wouldn't agree with that ideologically. I think that would be also a political mistake. But it is a possibility that if he doesn't have anything to show economically and he sees the risk of losing his core voters, then he might try to give them something on the social front. I hope not.
So now coming to the end of the conversation, what are you most looking out for as the new year starts, the new administration really gets going in terms of what they should be doing or what you think they should be doing and what you should recommend people who want to follow the, let's say, state of play of Argentina? What should they be looking at, reading, watching?
Excellent question. So the first huge thing will be the future of this executive decree I mentioned, 366 articles, I think. That would be the core of Milei's structural reforms. That is very important. We will see whether the courts allow it. We will see whether Congress tries to block it, and they can. If both houses of Congress vote against it, then it's done. I think the key will be, regardless of beyond concrete measures, there's some key issues or aspects of this I would try to look at. One, can Milei build political support beyond his very narrow base of support in Congress? Can Milei reach out and build a sort of informal or formal coalition with provincial governors, with lawmakers, with mayors, with other groups in Argentine society? That is key for the sustainability of the reforms and for him to get the support he needs. And of course, that will mean compromises. That's democracy. That's how it works. Nobody gets what they want or everything they want in a democracy. So far, Milei has not been willing to accept this. And I think whether he can or not will really determine whether he has a chance of success or not. Another thing is beyond the structural aspects of this and changes towards competitiveness, towards allowing the private sector to invest without too many or burdensome restrictions, etc. That's great. And that I think it's an important agenda for the future of Argentine growth. That's key. But you need stability for that to work. So Milei, the success or failure of Milei's government, at least in the first couple of years, is not whether Milei can drastically change the structure of the Argentine economy and dismantle all of these entrenched interests, whatever, is whether Milei can bring inflation down. We have to remember that Menem in the 1990s was popular even as he was implementing pro-market reforms that were somewhat painful because, first, he brought down inflation. Dollarization, which is what Milei wanted to do, I think he has been convinced by now that is unfeasible, at least in the first couple of years. Argentina doesn't have enough dollars to dollarize, and it has to repay the debt with the IMF. It has so much stuff it needs those dollars for that dollarization right now is not an option.
I actually don't think that is reasonable to say. That's a whole different conversation. There are other reasons why you should not, or say, why he would not dollarize in the super short term. I know that a lot of people in Argentina use that argument that outside, but it's not very that good.
It's true that the Argentines have billions and billions of dollars, just not in the formal banking sector in Argentina. That money will not come back with Milei or with whoever. That money will remain because it's the consequence of decades of lack of trust and of shifting economic policies and instability, etc. But you have to admit, the central bank in Argentina is effectively broke. And I think the priority of the administration is, first, it's clear that Argentina will need some sort of new monetary arrangement. There's no trust in the peso. It has no legitimacy. And I think it will be very hard to have a normal economy without a drastic change in that. But at least I know you interviewed, for instance, Ocampo, who was the guy who was going to take over the central bank, and he didn't. And because Milei started listening to people who said, okay, there are other priorities. You shouldn't talk about shutting down the central bank. You should focus on more achievable short-term goals. That's fine. But I think going back to my original point, Milei's success will be measured in whether he can bring down inflation. Immediately after that, whether he can provide some level of economic growth. As I said, the Argentine economy has been virtually flat since 2011, 2012, which means some years it has gone down, some years it has gone up, but always back to the same level we were at in 2012. So I think that's the key. Whether Milei can bring down inflation, whether they can begin to normalize key economic variables, normalize the currency market, all of that will be crucial, much more than the long-term reforms. And then with the long-term reforms, going back to that, I think the key is whether this will be profound, sustainable change or one more turn of the pendulum Argentina has been stuck in for decades. It's all going to be reforms by executive decree. Are these going to be really about encouraging competition in the economy or removing the state so that some private actors can take over and continue to operate like they've done in the last few decades? The private sector in Argentina has also been part of this system of subsidies, protection, corruption, etc. It's not just the politicians or the unions or whatever. You have a business sector that is accustomed to working through the state, taking advantage of public funds, etc. Is Milei willing to really change the way the economy works? Or is this just about replacing state corruption with private corruption? Because as in any market economy, you need at least some institution that defends competition, that stops monopolies, that enforces market conditions, and you need oversight, you need the rule of law, you need separation of powers, etc. That is, for me, what real, durable, long-standing change would mean. An independent central bank, for instance, which Argentina doesn't have. All of these things. Is Milei going to move towards that, or will he only try to take shortcuts to try to get as much done, change as much as possible now? Don't bother going through Congress. Don't bother making these changes because we don't have time. That, I think, is the key. If Milei is really a turning point in Argentine history, or just a parenthesis and a turn to the typical pendulum Argentina has been stuck with for decades.
What should people be reading to get a good analysis of Argentinians' political situation as it evolves next year? English or Spanish, I should say.
You have the typical, The Economist, etc., or the Financial Times. I think within and outside of Argentina, Argentina has become a sort of, for the left, now Argentina, of course, will become this land that was perfectly fine until this monster Milei arrived and began to dismantle social rights, which of course is false. Then you have the right, and they would say Argentina in 1895 was this great country. Then Perón came and everything was ruined. I really don't know. I can't tell you, read this, because these people tell the truth. I think, as in any case, you really need to expose yourself to a lot of extreme views about Argentina. At least what I try to do is, okay, probably truth, I would agree with one on different aspects of one tendency rather than the other, but it's about not reading just one source and one, as with anything, or one ideological perspective, because the good and bad thing about Argentina is that absolutely every perspective has been wrong or has failed. And you could debate it was because they weren't implemented correctly, or it was because they were sabotaged, or because whatever. This has happened many times in Argentine history. So I think the key is to read as much as possible from different sources and make up your own mind. and be prepared for, of course, the usual level of uncertainty, tension, and chaos that are common in Argentina. But I really wouldn't direct people to only one resource. And also, perhaps what I would suggest for some people is to read Argentine history, to understand how a lot of these discourses have actually existed for a long time, and how throughout Argentine history, different discourses, pro-market, anti-market, pro-state, anti-state, have been used to preserve a way of doing things that really changes little throughout history. Some people would think, oh, the dictatorship in the 1970s, that was drastically pro-market, blah, blah, blah. If you really read the history, it's not that clear-cut. So I would definitely suggest, there's an interesting book I like, which is a conversation between a historian and an economist, that is called La Moneda en el Aire. And it's a sort of discussion of Argentine economic policy since the consolidation of the state to today. And I think that kind of helps understand the cycles and how everything is really not new in Argentina. This typical saying that if you visit Argentina after 1 year, everything has changed. But if you visit Argentina after 20 years, nothing has changed. That sort of cyclic nature of it. So yeah, I would definitely suggest read a lot of sources, be willing to read people you profoundly disagree with, and then read some of Argentine history, and that will give you a good kind of base to try to understand. No, not that anybody can, but at least it will get you closer.
Bruno, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It was a really fun conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. For updates about the podcast, please subscribe to our Substack blog found on cpsi.media. You can also read our newsletters and long-form content on Caribbean policy improvements.